Hello, welcome back to Crushing Sounds and Remain Indoors. Yeah, crazy times, right? So, long time no see, here I am. I'm sure you all are struggling in various different ways with everything that's going on around the world right now. I myself am one of the lucky people who've managed to maintain my job throughout all of this, but I work in a supermarket really, so I guess you could call me a key worker, but if you ask me, the real key workers are obviously, people in the emergency services, the NHS, all that, those amazing people. But it means I got extremely busy at work there a lot more often. There was one week where I was there all the time, and I just became really down. I was not feeling productive at all, so these videos stopped. I have a written finished review for the Code Orange album. I will review that at some point because I want to talk about it. I haven't even heard the new Mercure album yet. I did want to, I planned to, but I just haven't got around to it because I was really not feeling up to it. But fortunately, a band that has managed to get me out of that slump, as it were, is the subject of today's review, the new double album by symphonic metal giant Nightwish. I've mentioned a number of times across my various reviews and other such things that I really, really like Nightwish. I like folk and symphonic music in general, but Nightwish were the band that really got me into that particular subgenre, as it were, of metal. They were one of those bands that I was always aware of, them being such a big band, how could I not be aware of them? But I kind of ignored them. Call me a naive idiot teenager, because I was, but when I saw that the band were fronted by a female singer and they had that gothic kind of aesthetic kind of thing, I assumed they were similar to like Evanescence, Lacuna Coil, Within Temptation, that kind of thing, which is not the kind of thing I really liked, or like still really, but I think I've come a long way from not judging bands based on their appearances, and certainly not judging bands based on the fact they have a female singer, which is something the entire scene was guilty of at the beginning and mid 2000s, something which looks like we're starting to finally get away from, but we were all idiot teenagers once. But what prompted me to finally check out Nightwish was when they were sub headliners for Iron Maiden at Download, I believe it was Download 2016. I figured I'd be sitting through them, waiting for. Actually, no, it was 2017. I remember now. Downloads 2017. I'm pretty sure. But I figured I'd be sitting through them, waiting to get to Iron Maiden. So I figured, why not? I'll check out some of their stuff. And I ended up stumbling upon a live performance of Everdream from their DVD of their Wacken show. And long story short, I was hooked. I loved the epicness, I loved the whimsical aesthetic, I loved that kind of, not power metal kind of thing. It veers on power metal a little bit, but it's more grand than that. And I thought Floor Jansen was a phenomenal singer. I still do think she is a phenomenal singer. I haven't combed through their entire discography. In fact, I haven't heard half of it. I started with Endless Forms Most Beautiful, and then I went and listened to Imaginarium over and over and over again. I say this as someone who's a fan of prog metal, death metal, gore grind, etc. Here I am wearing a Bathory t-shirt, but Imaginarium is one of my favourite albums ever made. I don't know what it is, but that album just gets me. I can listen to it in its entirety anytime. It's thematically solid, everything feeds together, the choruses are catchy, and although Floor is my favourite Nightwish singer, Annette nails it on Imaginarium, she's perfect for it, and the movie that was made alongside it is a thing. I might talk about that one day, who knows. My only issue on that album is the horrendous guitar production, which is fucking disgusting. What the hell happened there? But I've heard one album from the original singer. Her name was Tarja, I think is how you pronounce it, and it was the band's second album, Oceanborn, and I liked that one as well. I heard that one because it was gifted to me. So I don't mean to jump into a retrospective of the band's career, I just wanted to firstly establish where I'm coming from when I listen to Human Nature, the new album. So despite the band having one of my favourite albums ever made, I consider myself a casual fan of Nightwish as a whole. I've only listened to half their discography, as I said. I haven't even heard what's supposed to be their magnum opus, the album, once, although I have heard the big tracks on that album because they play them live and whatnot. So, yeah, I'm mostly a fan of the stuff that they've done in the second half of their career, starting with Dark Passion Play through to now, basically. However, they did have a noticeable shift when switching from Annette to Floor Jansen after the Imaginarium album. Whilst the two albums with Annette I guess you could describe as kind of Tim Burton with a sprinkling of Disney, with the whole symphonic heavy metal thing propping that up. Um, the the now two albums we have with Floor are more of the epic symphonic orchestral kind of thing, less fantasy, more classic orchestra, I suppose. Not that Imaginarium didn't have those moments, but they're much more in the forefront now than they were on Annette's two albums, basically. So 5 long years after the release of the last album, Endless Forms Most Beautiful, we finally have the follow-up and the second album with Floor, Nightwish's ninth album, Human Nature. It's also the band's first attempt at a double album, with the first side having 9 tracks across 50 minutes, and the second side containing a 30-minute song, which is split up into various sections, which is an epic piece of orchestral music. I'm going to split this review up into 2 different parts, one where I talk about disc 1, and one where I talk about the 30-minute track, almost as if they're 2 separate albums, but they're both part of this double album. So Thomas, however you pronounce it, sort of the band leader and main composer for Nightwish, mentioned in an interview in 2016 that the follow-up to Endless Forms Most Beautiful would continue the themes established on that album. Had I not read that before hearing this album, I probably would have guessed that was the case, because Human Nature is very clearly a follow-up to the previous album in its tone and subject. It continues the songwriting themes of existence, life, evolution, etc., so less fantasy, inspiration as a whole. The 2 albums therefore do feel intrinsically linked, and almost like this album is a sequel to that one, so I think you could listen to both and have a full experience, although that would be a very long listen. Whilst I do of course love fantasy and fantasy in heavy metal, that's just perfect for me. Watch my Blind Guardian review for evidence of that. But I also love the subjects on Endless Forms Most Beautiful, and this album. I have an interest in philosophy and nature since I studied philosophy and during my A-levels. I'm not an expert in philosophy, by the way, but it's something I do find legitimately interesting, so I love those themes being explored in heavy metal. So Human Nature begins with a song simply called Music, and it's used to set up the tone and themes of the album. It tries to represent music throughout history, apparently, by beginning with simple primal noises, moving into more percussive sounds, and then eventually growing into Nightwish trademark symphonic metal style by the end. It's a cool idea that sets up the album well enough. I almost wish, though, it was its own idea expanded into like a 20-minute piece that covered all of human history, however long that may need to be, but that could have been huge and epic. Still, that isn't the point. That's just a dream that I've had, really, but it's here to set up the album and it does it well. With a catchy chorus to boot, and a cool choir part singing over the top of the strings that reminds me a lot of Endless Forms Most Beautiful, so the similarities are there right from the off. Admittedly, I'm not too crazy about the second track, Noise. It was the first single released for the album. Funnily enough, that also mirrors Endless Forms Most Beautiful, as I wasn't too enamoured with the lead single of that album either. The chorus just doesn't do much for me. It's a bit weak, even with Floor doing that high inflection at the end of the chorus, which is quite good to be honest, but I like the fast tremolo bit around 4 minutes in, but that's about it. And also, can we just agree that the futuristic robot voice effect thing does not fit with Nightwish sound and style at all, and they should just never do it again, please? That would be great. Yeah, but if you liked their previous album, which I have stated that I did very much, I think you will enjoy this album too, as, again, it follows that album very closely. Shoemaker's drop-down bits are very pleasing. It has a big epic outro that shows that Floor is more than capable of doing the operatic style that classic fans miss so much. Pan is epic all the way through, although with that one, I can't not hear the melody from the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. Listen to it and see if you can hear what I mean. It's not a bad thing, it's a great piece of music, but it's so similar to the main theme of Pirates of the Caribbean, it was a bit like, whoa, okay, I wasn't expecting that. On a side note though, if for whatever reason you find yourself watching the original 3 Pirates of the Caribbean movies, if for whatever reason you're doing that, I urge you to take a minute and listen to the soundtrack of those movies. They're surprisingly good, and the best thing about those mixed bag movies, but for sure. But, yeah, so that side. For me, there are 2 tracks on the album that try to do something quite a bit different, and I'm going to talk about those most prominently. The rest of the songs, they're all good. They're all good. None of them are have anything that's massive to talk about other than the closing track, which I'll come to in a minute. But the two that caught my eye, firstly, is the fourth track and the second single, Harvest. I guess you could call it a ballad, but that doesn't really explain it that well. It's kind of a mellow, tribe sounding thing. That doesn't really work either, but I guess the best thing I could say to compare it to is it sounds like an overture song for a Disney movie that takes place in a separate culture, like Pocahontas or Moana or Brother Bear or things like that. It's got that. Uh, I don't know. That's honestly the best way I can think to describe it. That should probably tell you everything you need to know about whether you will like the song or not. Uh, Give it a listen and see what you think. The distorted guitars do come back in halfway through, um, which hopefully will salvage it if you don't like the weird acoustic chanty thing that happens throughout most of the song. I do quite like Disney movies. It's kind of a guilty pleasure of mine, so that might be why I quite like the song. Um, I can see it being very polarizing, with some people loving it and other people absolutely loathing it. But another reason why I really like it is it has Troy, the pipe player of the band, in the lead vocal part, and he's a great singer. I loved him in the song The Crow, the Owl, and the Dove from Imaginarium, and I think they should use him more because I love his vocal style. But I will be curious to see how people will respond to this song because it is quite interesting. But the other interesting track later on in the album is called Tribal. While not as out there as Harvest, it does stand out on its own on this album. It's the heaviest track by far, and reminds me of Yours Is an Empty Hope from the previous album. But the interesting bit is the second half. The band start making tribal noises along with the rhythm of the drums. It's a bit weird, but I could see what they're going for. Also, the drum outro is one of the highlights of the entire album. It's just fantastic. It's got that really. If you could just imagine like a tribal theme on the drums, it's that kind of thing, and it's really, really cool. I can see why fans of the band Winter Sun really want this guy to ditch Nightwish and go back to the band because he's a phenomenal drummer. He's really, really good. I also really like the track Endlessness. It, at long last, gives Marco's voice the lead. He has such a good voice, and I really wish he had more presence during the album, to be perfectly honest. I don't want him to be on equal standing with Floor, but on previous albums, he provides such a good counter to her operatic singing, and it works. It's one of the main reasons I love songs like Ghost River or the masterpiece The Islander. Either way, this is his song predominantly, and it's great. It feels like a closing track, which I always like to hear at the end of albums. It has big sweeping guitar lines that provide depth, but it's also very melancholy. It's probably the most melancholy song I've ever heard from Nightwish, and to put that as the outro on the first disc of a double album, I think is quite bold. But I love that design decision. The ending of Endless Forms Most Beautiful has an epic and inspiring outro, which I adore, but this one tries to do the opposite thing, and it makes it feel like a follow up to that album, but not by doing the exact same thing again, which is a great idea, if you ask me. I think if I were to find some negatives for this half of the album, and it's not really a negative, more something I just found a bit disappointing, I never had that moment on the album. And what I mean is that when I first heard songs like Shudder Before the Beautiful on the previous album, or Greatest Show on Earth, the 20-minute epic from the previous album, or Song of Myself from Imaginarium, I was left with this sort of stunned silence and awe over what I had just heard. I never had that on that album. Endlessness comes close, but not quite there. The counter argument to this, obviously, is while they're saving that impact for the 30-minute song on side two, which, yes, fair enough, it might well be, but A, that doesn't stop this album having some of that as well, and B, this is a 15-minute part of the double album, and to not have that moment after 50 minutes is admittedly quite disappointing, and to say the second album makes up for that, to me, doesn't really cut it, because this album, this half, should have that as well at points. Again, it's not really a negative, but when I think about my favourite Nightwish songs, I think of songs with impact that really cut you deep, and this album unfortunately didn't quite achieve that. That's just me though. I'm sure some people can have that moment on this album. It's just something that didn't quite get to me. Despite that, I did really like the album. It works as a follow up to the previous one, and it works on its own merits as well. I think my favourites would probably be Pan, Endlessness, and the potentially polarising Harvest. I'll need to let it simmer before I decide which I prefer over this to the previous album, but part 1 of Human Nature is solid, and I think it'll only grow on me in time. And it's an album that reaffirms why Nightwish got me into this subgenre of metal in the first place. Of course, so that's only 2/3 of the package. The second disc on this double album contains one 30-minute song, which is titled All the Works of Nature Which Adorn the World. It is split up into 8 parts, with their own titles and different musical pieces that change about. That was performed by the London Session Orchestra, who I think are the orchestra that do the orchestral bits on the rest of the album. I'm not sure, I couldn't find any confirmation on that. It is strictly a classical piece of music, no metal in it whatsoever, no lyrics either, so know that before you go into this 30-minute marathon. If you don't like instrumentals, that might be a bit hard for you to swallow, but I would urge you to give it a try. Whilst having it split up into different sections is handy for when I'm making notes on what I'm hearing, I would implore anyone who listens to this to hear it in its entirety and in one sitting. You won't get the full experience if you jump into anywhere at random. You can probably get away with hearing some great pieces of music within it and by hearing it in isolation, but the ending, for example, won't have nearly as much impact if you just jump in any old place, or even, God forbid, don't go straight to the ending. Don't do that. But yeah, so hear it all the way through, at least on your first listen. So the song opens up with a spoken word section which establishes the ideas and setting of the song. I'm very hit or miss with spoken word in music. Sometimes I feel it feels tacked on to make songs feel like they have more weight than they do, and at worst, they just spell out the meaning of things. But other times, they can really enhance a song for me and make it even better. Nightwish, fortunately, are one of those bands that are consistently in the latter when it comes to that sort of thing. It's on this part, it's very powerful stuff, very well written as well. I do miss Richard Dawkins' spoken word from the last album, but hey, I'm a fan of Richard Dawkins, so fair enough. Although English actress Geraldine James, she does a great job on here as well. There's also one or two places in this opening part, where we can hear Floor's vocals. They're not lyrics, they're just melody lines, but it's very pleasing and sets the song off quite nicely. I'm trying not to go through each part of the song in general, because I want to view it as one piece of music rather than separate tracks, but each piece does feel distinctly different from the one that came before and the one that comes after, which is great. For a song this long to have the listener's attention all the way through, the parts need to be distinct so it doesn't get too repetitive. This, however, does feed into a slight issue I have with the song. Whilst each track is distinct, sometimes they can be a bit too distinct. There aren't many in the way of callbacks or recurring phrases to give the overall song an identity as a whole, rather separate pieces of music centering on one central idea and narrative. That's something I know that's probably my personal preference, but I couldn't help but notice the absence of that kind of thing. I think the one time the song does that is during the part called The Moors. We hear a repeated phrase that gets brought back in the final part of the album, which it's a really effective, simple phrase, and it works really well, so I loved that. I wanted to hear more of that. Despite that, though, each part is good, and tonally they all work together, even though they're doing something a little bit different. But another problem I have, just the only other problem I have, I personally, it has 3 instances of dropping out entirely all sound before starting up the next part of the song. It does this between parts the blue and the green. It does it between Aurora and Quiet as the Snow, and it does it between Anthropocene and Ad Astra. I understand that silence can be a powerful effect. In fact, the 20-minute song, Greatest Show on Earth, had a break in the middle of it, but that had sound to aid the transition to the other section, and it was done purposefully and felt really effective and necessary. Doing it 3 times across this one song feels like a more safe way to transition between sections rather than being done for an artistic reason, which does take me out of it a little bit. I'd rather have it feel like one big piece of music than a few breaks here and there. But again, personal preference, I'm aware. Those are more little issues I have, simply just how I like songs of this length to be. If you don't mind that sort of thing and just like the song to change throughout so it stays interesting, then you have that here for sure. It takes its time throughout the majority. It doesn't get epic until the very end of the song, which on the surface would leave me disappointed, but here I don't mind it. Each part is beautifully written music, and it makes the final track all the more epic as it's not overshadowed by epicness that came before. Some of my favourite parts are part 3, The Green. It's very peaceful, it reminds me of the video game Ori and the Blind Forest, which is one of my favourite video game soundtracks of all time. I love part 4, Moors, which has excellent pipe playing, I presume from Troy, which sounds very nice, and the song has a really dark brooding bit halfway through, but then it effortlessly and expertly transitions back into the pipe playing, which is awesome. We also get the melody that would come back at the end of the song, and it's really, really good. And part 6, Quiet as the Snow, it's just a beautiful piece of music that reminds me a lot of Imaginarium. It all builds up to the ending part, though, Ad Astra, which is a phenomenal outro. It starts off with more spoken words, so the song ends how it started, which is a nice touch. Throughout the spoken word, we can hear the piece from the moor climbing up in the background. Then once the spoken word ends, it surges straight into its huge climax, which I think gets all the better once Floor's vocals also get added into the mix as well. This was that moment that I was referring to earlier. This outro was a brilliant end to the song and the album as a whole. My only gripe is I would rather a slow, restrained end of the part, like Greatest Show on Earth, rather than a sudden stop, which this one does. But that is powerful in its own way, so I can see why it's done. It's just another personal preference thing. Overall, I think all the works of nature which adorn the world is a great, beautiful piece of music. I was expecting something more epic going in than what it ended up being, something along the lines of Greatest Show on Earth, but longer. But instead, we have this very somber, restrained, and thoughtful observation and contemplation of life and existence. It may be 30 minutes, but it certainly didn't feel like it. And I went right back round to hear it again after I'd finished, not just to make notes, but because I wanted to hear it again. Whilst it does have its big surging moments and brooding foreboding moments, it's a nice piece of music that, frankly, I think the world needs right now. It needs a pleasant piece of music like that. So looking at the double album as a whole, I can say this album to me was worth the 5-year wait between albums. It's the perfect follow-up to Endless Forms, Most Beautiful, and it's only grown on me since I've heard it for the first time when the album dropped. Even as I was writing the script for this, I was still listening to the album, just thinking more and more fondly of it as I went. If you liked the previous album, you should definitely hear this one, and listen to that 30-minute piece all the way through, no breaks, just hear it all the way through for God's sake. Both sides of the album are different in their own way, but both I think of quite fondly. It doesn't feel as epic as Endless Forms, but I don't think it was trying to be. It yearned to be a thoughtful contemplation of the world, and I would say it definitely succeeded. And right now, we need introspective albums like that to really evaluate our place in the world, as it were. So, thank you so much for coming back to watch this video after my very, very long absence. I'll make sure it's not nearly this long again before the next one. Probably Code Orange coming next, we'll see about that. But yeah, cheers for sticking around. This might be one of my longest standard reviews yet, 23 minutes 15 at the moment, bloody hell. Yeah, cheers for checking this out. My name is Chris, hopefully I'm back now. Stay safe out there, stay indoors, just do what you need to do. Stay safe and look after each other. Alright. See you guys. See you next time. Bye bye.